The mess hall went quiet the second he said it. Not the polite kind of quiet, the kind that drops like a stone into still water and ripples out until nobody breathes. Tom Harker was on his knees scrubbing dried gravy off the floor when Admiral Marcus Whitmore crouched down beside him, smirking for the crowd of elite SEALs watching from their tables. "Hey, old man," the Admiral said, loud enough to carry. "What's your call sign?" It was meant to be a joke. Everyone knew it. Tom set down his scrub brush, looked up, and said 2 words. "Lone Eagle." The Admiral's smirk died before it finished forming. If this story already has your heart pounding, hit that subscribe button and follow along until the very end. Like this video and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. The morning had started the way most of Tom Harker's mornings started, before anyone else arrived, in the gray half-light when the base felt like a held breath. He pushed his mop bucket through the double doors of the Kellard Naval Station mess hall at 0530, the wheels squeaking against the tile in a rhythm he'd long since stopped hearing. The cleaning crew usually had 2 other guys, but Pete had called out sick again and Danny was covering the vehicle bay, so it was just Tom and 4,000 square feet of industrial kitchen and dining hall to get through before the first watch rotation came in at 0630. He didn't mind. He'd learned years ago that a quiet building and a clear task were 2 things you didn't take for granted. Tom was 51, though most people guessed older because of the way he moved. Careful, deliberate, like a man who had learned the hard way that rushing things got people hurt. His face was weathered in the specific way of men who'd spent years outdoors in conditions that had nothing to do with recreation. There was a long scar that started just below his left ear and ran down to the edge of his jaw, which he'd had so long he sometimes forgot it was there until he caught his reflection in a window. His hands were big and calloused, the knuckles of his right hand slightly misaligned from a break that hadn't been set properly in the field. He wore a gray maintenance uniform with the Kellard Station patch on the shoulder and his name embroidered in yellow thread above the breast pocket. Harker. He'd been here 11 months. Before that, a school district in Morrow, Oregon, where he'd done the same job. Before that, he didn't spend much time on before that. By the time the mess hall doors banged open at 0620 and the first group of sailors came through talking loud about last night's game, Tom had finished the floors and was working on the serving line, wiping down the sneeze guards with a microfiber cloth. The sailors didn't look at him. They rarely did. He was part of the furniture, the guy with the mop, the guy who kept the coffee urns from crusting over, the guy who existed in the negative space between one person's attention and another's. That was fine. That was the point. The mess hall filled fast. Kellard was a significant installation, joint operations, training rotations, a SEAL qualification unit that cycled through candidates every 8 weeks. The QU boys were easy to spot, loud, physical, with that particular brand of arrogance that came from being genuinely excellent at something dangerous. They took the long table by the east windows every morning, 12 to 15 of them, depending on who had night ops. And they were hard on the support staff in the casual, thoughtless way of people who had never considered that the support staff were also people. Tom had worked around them for 11 months without incident. He'd learned their names without meaning to. You picked things up, working quietly in the background. And he'd formed the kind of distant, impersonal opinions about each of them that he kept entirely to himself. He was refilling the napkin dispensers at the end of the serving line when the room shifted. It wasn't a dramatic change, a slight recalibration of noise and posture, the way a group of people subtly reorganize themselves when someone important enters. Tom glanced toward the doors without meaning to and saw Admiral Marcus Whitmore come in with 2 aides and the base commander, Captain Delia Forsyth. Whitmore was SEAL royalty, Pacific Command, decorated 3 times, the kind of flag officer whose name showed up in training materials. He was in his early 60s, compact and gray-haired, with the face of a man who had spent decades making decisions in rooms where being wrong killed people. He said something to Forsyth that made her laugh, and the aides looked pleased to be near the laughter. Tom turned back to the napkin dispensers. He heard the QU table get louder as Whitmore passed. They always performed a little when brass was watching, and then he heard Whitmore stop, heard the conversation shift toward the table, heard the back and forth of men impressing and being impressed. He didn't listen closely. It wasn't his business. He'd moved to the nearest table with a spray bottle and a cloth, wiping down the surface between the breakfast trays, when he became aware that the conversation behind him had developed an edge. The kind of performed cruelty that group dynamics produced. Someone had found a target, and now everyone was leaning in. No, seriously, we should ask him. That was Kowalski, one of the QU instructors. Mid-30s, built like a refrigerator, the kind of man who enforced hierarchy through humor because it was more deniable than direct contempt. It's a tradition. You ask every new support guy. Tom kept wiping the table. Hey! That was Whitmore's voice, and Tom recognized with a flat, tired certainty that he was the hey in question. Maintenance, what's your call sign? A few people laughed. The joke was obvious, and they all got it. Janitors didn't have call signs. The question itself was the punchline. Tom set down his spray bottle. He turned around, not because he owed anyone a performance, but because he was being directly addressed by an admiral, and ignoring that would cause more trouble than whatever came next. Whitmore was closer than he'd expected, maybe 6 feet away, still wearing that easy smile that said he expected this to be fun. The QU boys were watching with the bright-eyed attention of people waiting for the drop. Tom looked at the admiral, not at the rank insignia, not at the aides, at the man's face. Lone Eagle, he said. The smile didn't just fade. It stopped, like a clock losing power mid-tick. Whitmore's eyes changed. Something moved through them that Tom recognized as the specific recalibration of a man whose mental file just pulled something unexpected. The mess hall didn't go quiet all at once. It happened in a wave, starting at the QU table and spreading outward as the men there recognized the call sign, or recognized Whitmore's reaction, or both. By the time the silence reached the far end of the hall, it was complete. Tom picked up his spray bottle and turned back to the table. He heard Whitmore say, very quietly, to one of his aides, "Leave us." The thing about call signs was that they followed you. Tom had understood this even before Lone Eagle got attached to him, back in the days when he was Lieutenant Thomas Harker, SEAL Team 6, running operations in places that didn't officially exist. Call signs were shorthand for everything the official record didn't capture. The particular way a man operated, the qualities that made him useful, or dangerous, or irreplaceable. Some call signs were jokes. Some were descriptions. Some were warnings. Lone Eagle had been a warning. He'd earned it in the Korash Valley during a 3-day situation that had started as a reconnaissance mission and turned into something else entirely when the extraction team didn't come. Tom had been separated from his unit, cut off, running on minimal water and worse sleep, and he'd done what needed doing to get himself and 2 other survivors out. The full after-action report was classified at a level he didn't think about anymore. The call sign stuck because the men who'd been there said he'd moved through that valley the way an eagle moved through thermals, silent, precise, untroubled by the distance between him and the ground. That had been 20 years ago, before Lena, before Marisol, before the world rearranged itself around a kitchen table in a house in Portland, and Tom Harker understood for the first time that he had something worth protecting that wasn't a mission objective. He hadn't heard the call sign spoken aloud in a long time. Hearing it come out of his own mouth felt strange, like wearing old clothes that still fit. Whitmore had sent his aides out of earshot and followed Tom to the cleaning cart at the edge of the serving area, which Tom thought showed a certain pragmatic intelligence. The Admiral didn't make a scene. He just came to where the conversation could be private. "Tom Harker," Whitmore said. Not a question. "Sir? You're—" Whitmore stopped, tried a different track. "I read the file. After you separated, I was a commander then, but I remembered the name." He paused again. "The file said you requested discharge for family reasons. That's accurate?" "It didn't say much else." "No, it wouldn't." Tom folded his microfiber cloth into thirds. It was something to do with his hands. "My wife was sick. She died 8 months after I separated. I had a 7-year-old daughter and no other family, seemed like the relevant factors." Whitmore was quiet for a moment. "You've been here 11 months. "Yes, sir." "Before that, a school district." Tom glanced at him. "You looked me up." "I had 10 minutes and a phone," Whitmore said, without apology. "I like to know who's in rooms with me." He paused. "You've been hiding." "I've been working." "Those aren't the same thing for most people. For you," Whitmore tilted his head. "Why here? Why a naval base?" Tom thought about how to answer that. He settled on something true that didn't cost too much. Daughter's in college at Kellard State. I wanted to be close. Base pays better than most civilian facilities, and there's no commute to speak of. He shrugged. It made sense. You're cleaning floors. Yes, sir, I am. Whitmore looked at him for a long moment with the evaluating gaze of a man who'd spent his career reading people in high-stakes conditions. Tom had been read by better, or anyway, by more, and he'd learned to let it happen without helping or hindering. He just looked back. Kowalski and his boys are never going to let this go, Whitmore said finally. Probably not. Does that bother you? Tom considered the question seriously, which it deserved. Not particularly, he said. They don't know me. I don't need them to. Something shifted in Whitmore's expression. Not quite admiration, but close. What happened to Lone Eagle? He asked, and it was a different kind of question than the one he'd been asking. Smaller, somehow. More personal. Tom picked up his cleaning cart and began moving toward the next table. He retired, he said. Same as anyone else. He was at his daughter's apartment by 1800. Marisol Harker was 22, in her last semester of a nursing program that she'd worked for harder than Tom liked to think about, because thinking about it reminded him how much she'd done on her own during the years when he'd been too wrecked with grief to be useful. She had her mother's face, the same wide-set dark eyes, and the same quality of paying close attention to things. And she had something her mother hadn't, which was a fine-tuned ability to read Tom specifically. She knew something was off before he finished taking his boots off at the door. You have your flat face on, she said from the kitchen, where she was doing something with a pan and a cutting board that smelled like garlic and onion. I always have that face. You have it worse than usual. She glanced over her shoulder. Rough day. Unusual day. He sat down at her kitchen table, which was the right size for one person, and had textbooks stacked on one end and a half-finished study guide on the other. Someone recognized me. Marisol put down the knife. She turned around and leaned against the counter, arms crossed, with the expression of someone bracing for information they'd always known was coming. What kind of someone? Admiral Whitmore, Pacific Command. She closed her eyes briefly. Dad? I didn't do anything. He asked a question and I answered it. You told him your call sign. It wasn't a question. She knew the shape of this story, in outline if not in detail. He asked directly. Tom spread his hands. I wasn't going to lie to a flag officer in a military mess hall with 20 witnesses. You could have just... She stopped. They both knew he couldn't have. She'd grown up watching her father be a lot of things, but she'd never watched him be dishonest about anything that mattered. Okay. What happened? He told her about the conversation, keeping it brief and factual. She listened the way she always listened, still, attentive, her face doing more work than her words. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Are you worried? She asked. About what? That he'll, I don't know, tell people, make a thing of it. Tom thought about Whitmore's face when he'd said Lone Eagle, the specific quality of that silence. I think he'll be discreet, he said. He seemed like a man who understood the value of discretion. And the guys at the table, the SEAL trainees or whatever? Instructors, he said. They'll talk, but it's a big base, people forget. Marisol turned back to the stove, adjusting something, and Tom watched her move around the small kitchen with the particular competence of someone who'd learned to do things on her own. It hurt in a way that he'd gotten used to, a low, constant ache that he'd stopped naming. Can I ask you something? She said without turning around. Yes. Do you miss it? He'd been asked versions of this question before, usually by people who expected either a romantic yes or a therapeutic no, both of which would have been false. He sat with it for a moment, the way he sat with most things. I miss parts of it, he said finally. The clarity, mostly. Knowing exactly what you're there to do. Knowing who's beside you and what they're capable of. He paused. I don't miss the cost. Marisol put 2 plates on the table without saying anything, and that was enough. The call came at 0340 the next morning. Tom was awake already. He usually was by 0300. an old habit from years of ops where 0300 was either the safest part of the night or the most dangerous, and his nervous system had never fully decided which. Sitting in the dark kitchen of his quarters with a cup of black coffee and the dim glow of the base's perimeter lights coming through the window. The number that came up was a DoD relay line he hadn't seen in over a decade, but recognized instantly. He stared at it for 2 rings. Then he picked up. Harker. The voice on the other end was General Dale Carter, and Tom knew it immediately despite the years and the mild digital compression of a secured line. Carter had been his commanding officer's commanding officer. The man 3 levels above him in the chain, the one who signed off on operations that didn't appear in public records. He had the kind of voice that stayed level regardless of circumstance, which Tom had always found either reassuring or ominous depending on the circumstance. "Sir," Tom said. "I'll skip the part where I explain how I found you," Carter said. "Whitmore called me last night. I'm guessing you anticipated that." "I considered the possibility." "Smart." A brief pause, and Tom heard the background noise of an active operations center, keyboards, low voices, the particular ambient pressure of a room full of people managing something urgent. "We have a situation." "I'm a janitor, sir." "You were a janitor yesterday," Carter said. "This morning you're the only man alive who's been in the Solkov River Basin and come back out. Specifically, the section around grid reference." He cited a set of coordinates that Tom hadn't heard spoken aloud since a classified briefing in a building that didn't have a public address. Tom was quiet for a moment. "That area is currently the location of a hostage situation involving 6 personnel, one of whom is an asset whose extraction is time-critical and cannot be handled through conventional channels." Carter's voice didn't change inflection. "We need Lone Eagle." Tom set down his coffee. "No." "Tom, with respect, General, I have a daughter in her final semester of school, a job that doesn't require me to get shot at, and I am 51 years old. My answer is no." Carter was quiet for long enough that Tom started to think the line had dropped. Then, "The team we're sending in is led by Lieutenant Commander Ava Reyes. You don't know her, but she knows your work. She asked for you specifically." "She asked for a legend that retired 15 years ago." "She asked for a man with irreplaceable operational knowledge of that terrain," Carter said. "There's a difference." Another pause. "I'm not ordering you, Harker. You're a civilian. I can't order you." He stopped, and Tom heard in that stop everything that wasn't being said. The weight of 6 people in an impossible place, the specific arithmetic of lives and risk that he'd done in his head 10,000 times. "But I'm asking." Tom looked out the window at the dark base, the perimeter lights, the flat geometric shapes of buildings built for purpose. "Who's the asset?" he said. Carter was quiet again. "The extraction target is a 26-year-old analyst named Rourke. He's been in place for 14 months. He has documentation of a weapons diversion operation, domestic, not foreign, that leads to people with stars on their shoulders." The general's voice stayed level. "If he doesn't come out in the next 48 hours, he doesn't come out." Tom pressed his thumb and forefinger against the bridge of his nose. "I want a full brief. Everything we have on current conditions in that basin. I want Reyes on the phone before I commit to anything. I can have both in 2 hours. And I want guarantee of full civilian status reinstatement for legal purposes. If this goes wrong, I'm not a ghost." "Already drafted," Carter said, which told Tom the general had been very confident about how this conversation would end, and Tom didn't know whether to be annoyed or impressed. He went with neither. 2 hours, he said, and ended the call. He sat in the dark for a while after that, with the cold coffee and the perimeter lights and the silence. He thought about Marisol in her apartment across the base, asleep over her textbooks, her nursing scrubs hanging on the back of the bathroom door. He thought about what she'd asked him over dinner. "Do you miss it?" He thought about the Solkov River Basin, the cold of it, the specific quality of the mud along the eastern bank, the way sound traveled differently there than anywhere else he'd operated, a trick of the terrain that had saved his life once and could do it again. He went to get dressed. Boy. Lieutenant Commander Ava Reyes was 38 and had the voice of someone who measured words carefully before spending them. She briefed him over a secured video link at 0600, sitting in what looked like a forward operating position, low-ceilinged, bare walls, the kind of space that had been a storage room before someone put a SATCOM terminal, In it. She didn't waste time being impressed by him, which he appreciated. Basin conditions have changed since your last stop there, she said, pulling up a terrain overlay that showed topographic shifts he hadn't seen before. The eastern approach is compromised. There was a landslide in 2019 that altered the riverbank and took out two of the natural cover positions that were reliable before. The western approach is intact but requires crossing about 600 meters of open ground at the tree line. Which they'll definitely be watching, she agreed. Our read is a 12 to 15-man force holding in the compound structure at this location. She indicated a position on the overlay, with the asset in a subsurface facility. We have one confirmed thermal signature below ground level, consistent with a single individual. How confident is the thermal data? 68%. She said it without flinching, which meant she was honest. It's got noise. The subsurface area has some kind of heating infrastructure that creates interference. We think it's him. We can't be certain. Tom studied the overlay. What's the timeline pressure? We have indication that the force holding the compound has been in contact with a secondary team. We think the secondary team is moving to relocate the asset. If that happens, she didn't finish. She didn't need to. Who gave them up? Tom said. Rourke. Someone burned him. Reyes met his eyes through the screen. That's an open question, which meant she had a theory she wasn't sharing yet, or that the answer was complicated in ways she wasn't cleared to discuss on this link. Tom filed it and moved on. Entry vector, he said. Walk me through what you're thinking. She did. It was a solid plan with 2 weak points that he identified immediately, and when he named them, she nodded in a way that suggested she'd already found them herself and was assessing whether he would. They spent 40 minutes working through alternatives, and at the end of it, he had the specific, quiet respect for her competence that came from watching someone think clearly under pressure without performing about it. You're good, he said, which was simply true, and not a compliment in the soft sense. I've had good teachers, she said. Some of them people who trained with you, back when. She paused. I need to ask you something directly. Go ahead. You've been out a long time, not just retired. Out. I've read accounts of the Valley Op. I know what you're capable of at your best. She held his gaze. I need to know if that's still you, because I can't take a liability into that basin. I can't afford sentiment. It was a fair question, and he didn't resent it. I run 6 miles every morning, he said. I work 12-hour days on my feet. I qualified on the range last month out of habit and put 30 rounds in a group you could cover with your palm at 50 meters. He paused. I'm not the man I was at 32, but I'm not a liability. Reyes studied him for a moment. Okay, she said. We embed you as tactical advisor for entry and extraction. You don't lead the team. I lead the team. But if we hit complications in the basin, your read on the terrain overrides mine. Agreed. We insert in 19 hours. She looked at her watch. Get some sleep, Harker. You're going to need it. He almost told her he didn't sleep much anymore. But that wasn't the kind of thing you said before an operation, so he just nodded and closed the link. He sat alone in the briefing room for a moment after the screen went dark, in the specific silence that preceded things you couldn't take back. Outside, the base was coming to life. He could hear the distant sounds of morning operations, the base waking up the way it did every day regardless of what was happening in rooms like this one. He thought about Marisol again. He'd need to call her. He'd need to tell her something that was true without being specific, the particular art of saying enough to someone you loved without handing them information that could hurt them. It was a skill he'd practiced long enough that he was good at it, and he hated that he was good at it. He also thought, and this surprised him a little, the way old reflexes sometimes surfaced unexpectedly, about the basin, about the specific quality of the cold there, the smell of the mud, the sound of the river. About the 3 days in the Korok Valley when he'd been reduced to pure function, no fear and no hope, just the next movement and the one after that. He told Marisol he missed the clarity. He hadn't told her that the clarity was the most dangerous thing about it, that it felt like relief. He stood up, straightened his chair, and went to find a phone. The call to Marisol was brief. He told her he had to travel for a few days on something work-related, which was technically accurate. She was quiet for a moment after he said it. How dangerous, she said. Not very, he said, which was not accurate at all. Another silence. Okay, she said finally, and the word carried about 12 different things in it that neither of them would say. Come back. I will, he said. He ended the call. He went to requisition equipment he hadn't needed in 15 years. The legend wasn't dead. It had just been waiting. And in a forward position 6 time zones away, in a subsurface room that smelled of damp earth and exhaust, a 26-year-old analyst named Rourke was listening to footsteps above his head and counting the hours he had left, not knowing that the one man who'd ever walked out of that basin alive had just agreed to walk back in. The footsteps above him stopped, and somewhere in the compound, a door opened. The door opening was the worst sound Rourke had heard in 3 days. Not because of what usually followed, the rough handling, the questions that weren't really questions, the particular kind of patience that men with leverage showed when they wanted you to understand how little your comfort mattered. He'd gotten used to the rhythm of that. What made this different was the quality of the footsteps descending the wooden stairs. Measured, unhurried. Not the heavy boots of the guards who brought him water twice a day, and not the lighter tread of the man who'd come twice to ask him things he hadn't answered. These were the footsteps of someone who had made a decision. The single bulb above him threw a weak yellow circle that left the corners of the room in darkness, and Rourke pressed his back against the damp stone wall and watched the stairwell and tried to calculate what he still had left to trade. Tom had forgotten how much he hated the pre-insertion waiting, the active part he could handle, the movement, the decisions, the compressed sensory field of an operation in progress where thought and action collapsed into something almost automatic. But the 6 hours before, sitting in a forward staging area with equipment checked and rechecked and nothing left to do but exist with the knowledge of what was coming, that part had always been the hardest, and apparently that hadn't changed with age. He sat against the wall of the staging room with his legs stretched out and his eyes closed, not sleeping, running terrain in his head. The basin. The eastern bank with its altered landscape he'd need to recalibrate for. The 600 meters of open ground on the western approach. The compound structure, which he'd studied in satellite imagery until he could close his eyes and walk through it room by room. The team was 4 people plus him. Reyes, who he'd assessed as the best tactical mind in the room by a distance. Sergeant First Class Dominic Farrell, who was 34 and had the quiet, banked intensity of a man who'd been in enough bad situations to stop being surprised by them. Corporal Tasha Wren, who was 29 and moved like someone with exceptional proprioception. She'd barely made a sound crossing the staging area's concrete floor in full kit, which Tom noticed and filed. And a comm specialist named Burke, who was the youngest of them at 26 and wore his nerves more visibly than the others, but kept his hands steady when he worked. Good team, not perfect. No team was perfect. Reyes came and sat beside him without preamble around hour 3. She had a photograph in her hand, printed on plain paper, the edges slightly curled. "Rourke," she said, and held it out. Tom looked at it. Young face, angular, dark circles under the eyes, even in what appeared to be an official photo taken before he went in. The eyes themselves were sharp. "Tell me about him," Tom said. Linguistics background, recruited out of Georgetown, fast-tracked because of his language profile. She paused. "He's good. Careful. He lasted 14 months in place, which is longer than anyone expected." She took the photo back. "He also has a 7-year-old sister with a medical condition that costs about $4,000 a month. His parents aren't—" She stopped. "He needed the work." Tom didn't say anything. "I'm not telling you that to make you feel something," Reyes said. "I'm telling you because it's relevant. It means he's motivated to come out. He'll cooperate with extraction. And the documentation he's carrying? Embedded in a device that looks like a standard dental implant. Radiologically indistinguishable." She paused. "Assuming he's still—" She didn't finish the sentence. "Assuming he's intact," Tom said. "Yes." They sat with that for a moment. Farrell was field stripping his sidearm across the room with the focused economy of someone who'd done it so many times it required no attention. Wren was studying the terrain overlay on a tablet, her finger tracing paths without touching the screen. Burke was running comms checks at the equipment table, murmuring numbers into a headset. "You asked me this morning if I was still the man who could do this," Tom said. "I did. I want to ask you something back." He looked at her. "You said burning Rourke was an open question. What's your actual read?" Reyes was quiet for a beat. "My actual read," she said carefully, "is that the burn came from inside the task force that set up his placement, not from his contact network and country. The way the compromise happened, the timing, what they moved on and what they didn't, it's too clean to be field intelligence. Someone read a document they weren't supposed to read and made a call. Someone with access to placement files. Someone with significant access," she said. "Not a clerk." She looked at the wall. "Which means we have to assume that whoever it is has ongoing visibility into the extraction planning." Tom turned that over. "Which is why you're running this with 4 people instead of 12. Small footprint, limited distribution," she confirmed. "Carter knows. 2 people at his level know. Below that, it's us." She paused. "And you." "And I'm a janitor," Tom said. "Exactly." She almost smiled. Completely off the radar. He thought about that, the strange recursive logic of it. The reason he was useful was the same reason he'd spent 11 months scrubbing floors, because nobody with access to operational files would think to look for Lone Eagle in a maintenance uniform on a naval base in Washington state. "Insertion in 3 hours, Reyes said, and stood up. "You should eat something." "I should," Tom agreed, and didn't move. The basin at night was exactly as cold as he remembered, and colder than the briefing materials had suggested. They'd inserted by HAHO jump, high altitude, high opening, long glide, the kind of approach that put them on the ground miles from any acoustic signature associated with aircraft. Tom hadn't jumped in 9 years. His body remembered before his mind caught up, the muscle memory of checking his canopy, reading the wind, adjusting his glide path toward the designated landing zone with the same trained automaticity that he'd once relied on every few weeks. He landed harder than he would have at 32. His knees took it, and he didn't go down, but he felt it in a way he wouldn't have felt it before. A structural protest that reminded him he was working with materials that had accumulated significant mileage. He didn't mention it. He folded his chute and moved. The team came together in a dry creek bed that cut through the tree line on the basin's northern approach. No talking, hand signals only. Reyes did a quick personnel check, 4 nods, including Tom, and they moved out. The terrain was both familiar and wrong, the way a place you knew well feels when you've been away long enough for it to change without you. The Eastern Bank's landslide had taken out more than the cover positions. It had altered the drainage patterns on that side of the river, creating new mudflats that didn't appear in older map overlays. Tom caught it before Farrell's boot went through the surface crust and tapped his shoulder, redirecting him 8 feet to the right where the ground was solid. Farrell looked at him. Tom pointed at the ground and shook his head. Farrell nodded and adjusted without asking for an explanation, which told Tom something useful about him. They moved 3 miles in 90 minutes, which was reasonable for the terrain and the load. The compound appeared at the edge of the tree line as a cluster of low structures that had been something agricultural before they were something else. The bones of a farm operation converted to current use, with newer construction added that showed in the different quality of materials. The lights on the perimeter that were too well positioned to be accidental. Tom counted the positions he could see from their observation point at the tree line's edge. 3 exterior guards, patrol pattern inconsistent. One of them was cutting his route short on the eastern side, probably because the collapsed bank on that corner made the footing unpleasant. There'd be more inside, but the 3 were the immediate problem. He touched Reyes's arm and pointed to the eastern guard, then traced the short patrol route with 2 fingers. She looked, then nodded. She'd seen it. She pointed to Wren, then to Farrell, and made a simultaneous gesture, both guards on the northern and western positions at the same time, no gap between. She pointed to Tom, then to the eastern route, and tilted her head in a question. He shook his head once. He pointed to himself, then to the gap between the eastern structure and the main building, The approach to what the thermal imaging suggested was the subsurface access point. She studied him for a moment in the dark, then nodded. The next 4 minutes happened in the compressed, hyper-present way that Tom had forgotten he missed. Not the violence of it, he'd never romanticized that, but the total elimination of everything irrelevant. There was only the compound, the spacing between the guards, the distance to the access point, the wind, the ground. Everything else in the world ceased to matter or even exist. He'd once tried to explain this to Lena, years ago, and she'd listened the way she listened to things she was trying to understand but knew she couldn't fully. "It sounds like the opposite of fear," she'd said, and he'd thought about it and said, "Maybe, or maybe it's what's left when fear runs out of room." He was at the access point, a metal hatch set into a concrete pad at the base of the eastern structure's wall, before the guards on the other two positions were neutralized. He heard the soft sounds of Farrell and Wren doing their work and didn't look up. He was focused on the hatch, which was padlocked with a standard commercial lock that told him something about how secure the people holding it felt. And he was through it in 40 seconds, using a tool from his kit. The stairs below were wooden and old, and he went down them slowly, placing each foot at the edge closest to the wall where the boards were least likely to flex. The room at the bottom smelled of damp concrete and something burnt, kerosene probably, from a small heater in the corner that was casting orange light across the space. There was a man sitting against the far wall with his knees pulled up and his hands zip-tied in front of him, and the man looked up when Tom descended and went rigid with the particular tension of someone who had been expecting something much worse. Tom held up one hand, palm out. He kept his voice below a murmur. "Rourke, I'm extraction. We have a team topside. Can you walk?" Rourke stared at him. He was thinner than the photograph, and there was dried blood at his hairline, and his eyes had the flattened quality of someone who'd been running on adrenaline and no sleep for too long. "Walk," he said, like the word needed to be tested. "Yeah, I can walk." Tom crossed the room, cut the zip ties with a folding knife, and pulled Rourke to his feet. The analyst swayed once and then steadied, which Tom took as a good sign. He assessed quickly. No obvious fractures, movement in all limbs, eyes tracking. Bruised, dehydrated, frightened, intact. "There's a device," Rourke said quietly. "I have documentation." "I know," Tom said. "We'll deal with that topside. Right now we move." He looked at the stairs. "Stay behind me and step where I step." They went up. The problem appeared at the tree line. They were 60 meters out, Rourke between Tom and Reyes, Farrell and Wren on the flanks, moving well and fast. And then Burke's voice came through the earpiece in a controlled, flat tone that Tom recognized as the voice of someone delivering information they hadn't wanted to collect. "We have vehicles. Northern approach road, 3 clicks, moving toward the compound. I'm counting 4 sets of headlights." Reyes's hand went up. "Halt." The team stopped. "Secondary team," she said, low and tight. "They're early." Tom was already calculating. The extraction route took them northwest through the tree line and then a river crossing at a shallow point 3 miles out, where a vehicle would be waiting. 3 clicks for the incoming vehicles on a dirt road. Call it 8 to 10 minutes, depending on road condition. 3 miles to the extraction point at their current pace. 30 minutes. Minimum. The math didn't work. "Alternative route," he said. "There isn't one that doesn't add 40 minutes. "There's one." He pulled up the terrain overlay in his head, the one he'd been running for hours. "Eastern bank, post-landslide." Reyes looked at him. "You said the drainage patterns changed." "They did. But the collapse created a debris field that runs along the base of the northern ridge. If the field is consolidated, and based on what I saw of the mudflat formation coming in, it should be, we can use it as a covered approach to the ridge crossing. It adds 15 minutes, not 40. If the field is consolidated." "Yes," he said. "If." She looked at him for exactly 3 seconds. Then, "Take point." They moved. The debris field was not fully consolidated. There were sections that held and sections that didn't, and Tom picked the path by reading the surface in the dark by instinct and the thin, ambient light from a cloud-diffused moon. And twice he redirected the group away from ground that looked solid but wasn't. The second time, Rourke's foot punched through to the ankle, and Tom caught his arm before he went down, and Rourke made a noise through his teeth that he quickly swallowed. Okay, Tom said quietly. Fine, Rourke said, which was clearly a lie, but the functional kind. Behind them, the headlights from the incoming vehicles had resolved into a visible glow above the tree line. They were at the compound now, or close to it. Tom didn't look back. Looking back served nothing. The ridge crossing was harder than he'd hoped and easier than he'd feared, which was about the best outcome available. They came down the other side with Farrell supporting Rourke's weight on the left and Wren on point, and the river appeared in the darkness below them as a sound before a sight. The specific murmur of shallow moving water over rounded stone that Tom had kept in his memory for 15 years without knowing he was keeping it. They crossed in under 4 minutes. Cold water, knee-deep at the worst point. Tom felt his body's protest at the cold as an intellectual fact rather than a physical sensation, which was either a good sign or a concerning one, and he didn't have time to determine which. The extraction vehicle was a covered cargo truck that looked like it belonged to an agricultural supply company, driven by a man named Solis, who'd apparently been sitting in the dark for 3 hours without complaint, and who said nothing when they piled in except, "Everyone accounted for." 6, Reyes said, which was the right number. Solis put the truck in gear. Tom sat on the floor of the truck bed with his back against the side panel and his eyes closed, listening to the team's breathing normalize around him. Burke was running a comms check with the forward position. Farrell was doing a weapons inventory by feel. Wren was wrapping Rourke's ankle in a field bandage with practiced efficiency. Rourke was watching Tom with an expression that was difficult to read in the dark, something between exhaustion and the particular quality of attention you paid to someone you'd just realized was unusual. "You knew that terrain," Rourke said quietly. "You've been there before." "Yes," Tom said. "Recently?" "No." Rourke processed that. "Who are you?" Tom didn't answer immediately. He heard Reyes, sitting 2 feet to his left, make a sound that might have been something close to a suppressed laugh. "Someone who used to do this," Tom said finally. "The janitor thing," Reyes said, and this time she didn't suppress it. It was quiet, but it was real. "I'm sorry," Rourke said. "Don't ask," Tom told him. "Rest." Rourke opened his mouth, then closed it, then did something very sensible and leaned his head back against the truck panel and let his eyes close. In 30 seconds, his breathing had the uneven depth of genuine sleep, the first real sleep, Tom guessed, he'd gotten in days, the body knowing when it was safe before the mind caught up. Tom stayed awake. That was habit too. It was Farrell who spoke first, maybe 20 minutes into the drive, his voice low enough not to carry past the immediate group. "That was clean work back there," the debris field read. "Lucky," Tom said. "It really wasn't," Farrell said, without inflection, which meant he meant it as a statement of fact rather than a compliment. Tom didn't argue. He thought about the mudflats on the eastern approach, and the thing about the secondary team showing up early, and the arithmetic of how a team traveling overland to a rural compound in a foreign operational theater coordinated timing with any precision unless they had... He stopped the thought, examined it, started it again, more carefully. The secondary team had been 3 clicks out on the northern approach when Burke picked them up, moving toward the compound. If they'd been responding to a triggered alarm, someone discovering the neutralized guards, a missed check-in, they'd have been moving faster. They'd been moving at a steady road pace, the pace of a team that knew where it was going and roughly when it needed to get there, which meant they'd had prior information about the timeline. "Reyes," he said. She'd been watching him since Farrell spoke. She was good that way, always a half beat ahead of where you thought she was. "I know," she said quietly. "They had the extraction window." "I know." "Which means the leak is active, not historical. Active." "I know," she said, for the 3rd time, and this time there was something underneath the flatness that told him she'd been sitting with this calculation since the headlights appeared, and possibly before, and the specific weight of who she suspected was something she was carrying alone. The truck hit a rut, and everyone shifted. Rourke didn't wake up. Tom looked at Reyes in the dim cargo space and asked the question that needed asking. How many people knew the window? She was quiet for long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then she said, 6 people above our level, Carter, and 5 below him. She paused. And one person who shouldn't have. Something in her voice when she said it, the specific flatness of someone controlling a feeling rather than not having one, told Tom this wasn't abstract. He felt the shape of it before she said the next thing. Harker, she said. Victor Kane is on the recovery coordination team. The name landed in Tom's chest like something physical. Victor Kane, his former commanding officer, the man who'd signed off on the Corach Valley operation, the man who'd been 3 levels above him in the chain when Tom was active, and who Tom now understood with the sudden, awful clarity of a thing you should have seen coming, had been in a position to read placement files, extraction timelines, and the operational history of a retired SEAL who'd once been called Lone Eagle. The truck drove on through the dark. Tom sat very still and felt the past reach forward and close its hand around the present, and understood that the operation wasn't over. It had barely started. The name sat between them in the dark cargo space like something with weight. Tom didn't ask Reyes to repeat it. He didn't need to. He just let it settle. The way you let something settle when the alternative was reacting before you understood what you were reacting to, and he listened to the truck's engine and the road noise and Rourke's uneven breathing, and he let Victor Kane's name do what it needed to do in his chest before he put it somewhere manageable. Kane had been his CO for 3 years. Not a close relationship. Tom had never been the kind of operator who formed attachments up the chain, but a functional one, built on mutual competence and the particular brand of professional respect that developed between men who understood what the job actually required. Kane was technically brilliant, politically skilled in the way of career officers who learned early how to translate battlefield results into institutional capital. Tom had trusted his judgment on operational matters without particularly liking him as a person, which had seemed like a reasonable arrangement at the time. He was trying to locate now, working backward through memory, the moment when that arrangement should have felt less reasonable. He couldn't find a clear one, which meant either he'd missed something or Kane had been very careful. Possibly both. Tell me what you know, he said to Reyes. When we land, she said. Not here. He looked at her. She had one eye on the back of the truck, where Burke was still running comms at the far end, and Tom understood compartmentalization, active leak. She was running a very tight information circle, and she hadn't fully decided where Tom sat in it yet. That was fair. That was correct procedure. He closed his eyes and went back to running terrain. The forward staging area on the return side was a converted storage facility 20 minutes from the airport that Reyes had requisitioned under a logistics cover that Tom didn't ask about. It had electricity, running water that was technically warm if you gave it long enough, and a folding table that Burke immediately colonized with his equipment. Rourke went into a side room with Wren, who had field medicine quals and was running a proper assessment on his ankle. Swollen, probably a grade 2 sprain, nothing structural, along with checking the rest of him for the kind of damage that wasn't always visible. Tom heard the low murmur of questions and answers and the occasional sharp intake of breath, and he didn't listen closely because it wasn't his business. Farrell stood post at the door, which left Tom and Reyes at the folding table in the main room, and Reyes pulled out a phone that Tom hadn't seen before, a different device than she'd used during the briefing, and set it on the table between them. Kane's been on the recovery coordination team for 11 days, she said, keeping her voice level but quiet. Carter put him there because he has operational history in the region. What Carter didn't know, what I found 6 days ago, is that Kane has been running a secondary financial operation through a series of shell intermediaries that connect to the weapons diversion that Rourke documented. Tom looked at the phone. He's the one the documentation implicates. Partially, he's a node, not the top, but he's a significant node, and he knew about Rourke's placement because he was read in as part of the coordination team, and he's been feeding timeline intelligence to the force holding Rourke for at least 3 weeks. She paused. The secondary team tonight wasn't a response to the extraction. They were going to move Rourke to a third location where the documentation could be extracted from the device, and then... She stopped. And then Rourke stops being useful, Tom said. Yes. Tom sat with that for a moment. 26 years old, 7-year-old sister with a medical condition. 14 months in place, careful enough to last that long, And the danger was never the people in the country. It was the person sitting in an office building 3 time zones away with a security clearance and a financial interest. "Why didn't you take this to Carter before the insertion?" he said. "Because I wasn't certain. I'm still not certain. I have connectivity data, financial flow analysis, timing correlations. I don't have a document with Kane's name on it saying what he did. What Rourke is carrying might give me that." She looked at the phone. "Or it might not be enough. And if you'd flagged Kane and been wrong, then the man who is about to betray us to his contacts in the field gets 6 hours of warning that I'm looking at him." She shook her head. "I couldn't afford the error, so I ran it small." Tom understood. He didn't entirely like it. There was a version of the calculation where she'd gambled with the team's lives on an incomplete read, but he understood. These were the decisions that lived in the gap between correct procedure and correct outcome, and you only got judged on the outcome. "Kane knows I'm on this team," he said. "Yes, which means he knows Lone Eagle came out of retirement for this specific operation." Tom looked at his hands on the table. "Which means he has a problem." Reyes looked at him. "You think he'll move?" "I think a man who's been running a secondary operation through 5 layers of institutional cover for however long he's been running, it doesn't sit still when the extraction he tried to compromise succeeds, and the one operator alive who knows his history is now holding the evidence." He paused. "He'll try to control the damage, and his best option for that is controlling what Rourke's documentation shows before it reaches anyone with authority to act on it." The room was quiet. From the side room, Tom heard Wren say something that made Rourke laugh once, short and involuntary, the laugh of someone surprised by the sound of their own humor. "We need to move the documentation to Carter in the next 4 hours, Reyes said. "Yes. Which means we need to assume Kane is already working on how to intercept that transfer." She looked at him directly. "You know how he thinks. I knew how he thought 15 years ago. Is that still useful?" Tom thought about the operation in the Korak Valley, about the briefing beforehand, the precise way Kane had laid out contingencies, systematic, layered, always with a second plan behind the first and a third behind that. The kind of mind that didn't improvise so much as it pre-solved multiple futures and then executed the relevant one when the moment arrived. "Probably," he said. Reyes picked up the new phone and made a call that lasted 40 seconds, said 4 words that Tom didn't recognize as a standard protocol, and ended it. "I have a secure transfer line opening in 3 hours, she said. "We need Rourke stable and the device accessed before then." "The device access? Does Rourke do that himself?" "He's the only one who can," she paused. "The implant requires biometric plus a passcode that only he knows. It was designed that way specifically so the documentation couldn't be extracted under duress." Tom nodded. That was good design. It was also a problem if Rourke was in worse shape than he appeared, and Tom made a note to check. He went to the side room. Wren had Rourke's ankle wrapped and elevated on a folded jacket, and she'd cleaned the cut at his hairline, which turned out to be shallower than it had looked. Head wounds dramatic, body dishonest about severity. Rourke was sitting up and drinking water with both hands around the cup, and he looked up when Tom came in. "How are you doing?" Tom asked. "Structurally?" Rourke looked at his hands. "Better than I was 3 hours ago." He paused. They weren't trying to hurt me. They were keeping me operational, which is its own kind of information. They needed you functional until they could get to the documentation. "Yeah, I figured that out around day 2. He set the cup down. "There's a man, I heard his name on a call I wasn't supposed to hear. I didn't know who he was in the field, but I filed it. The name was Kane." Tom went still. Rourke looked at him. "That means something to you." "It means something," Tom said. "Is it in the documentation, what I'm carrying?" "Some of it. We need to access the device." Tom kept his voice even. "Can you do that now?" "Yes." Rourke pressed his fingers briefly against his jaw where the implant was, a reflexive gesture. "It'll take about 20 minutes with the right equipment. Burke's setup should have what I need." "Good." Tom started to turn. "Hey." Rourke's voice stopped him. The analyst was looking at him with the direct, tired gaze of someone who'd run out of energy for anything except directness. I heard what Reyes called you when we were in the truck. He paused. Lone Eagle. That's not a current operator call sign. No, Tom agreed. You're the one from the Korak Valley report. Not a question. Rourke had been an analyst, and analysts put things together. The 3-day extraction. That's been a case study in compartmented OPI methodology for over a decade. I wouldn't know, Tom said. I wasn't reading the case studies. What were you doing? Tom thought about his cleaning cart, the quiet of the mess hall at 0530, Marisol's kitchen table with its textbooks and study guides. Living, he said, and left it at that. Mom, Burke got Rourke connected to the extraction equipment in 40 minutes, longer than Rourke had estimated, because the device access protocol was more sensitive than the available tools were calibrated for, and Burke had to improvise 2 adapters that he built from components in his kit with the focused, granular attention of a man who was very good at one specific thing. Tom watched the door while this happened, not the physical door, Farrell had that, but the perimeter, the access points, the variables he could influence from inside the building by staying alert and thinking 3 steps ahead. At the 90-minute mark, with the secure transfer window opening in less than 2 hours, Burke said, "Got it," in a flat voice that carried the specific satisfaction of a problem solved. And then the room got very quiet as the documentation began populating on the screen. Tom didn't look at it. That wasn't his role, and he had enough to carry. He watched Reyes read, and watched her face, and got most of what he needed from the quality of her stillness. Kane's name is in here 14 times, she said finally. Transaction records, communication logs, 2 operational approvals that went through a cover authorization chain. She looked up. It's enough. Rourke, sitting beside Burke, let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep. 14 months, he said quietly. Okay. Reyes was already on the new phone. She got Carter on the 3rd relay, spoke for 2 minutes, and Tom heard in her voice the particular clarity of someone delivering information they'd been holding at high pressure for a long time. Carter's voice was inaudible from where Tom stood, but he heard its register, controlled, absorptive, the voice of a man receiving something significant and calibrating his response before it showed. When she ended the call, she held the phone for a moment before setting it down. Kane was in the building when Carter took the call, she said. He's been flagged. Security is moving. Farrell from the door said, So it's done? The documentation transfer is done, Reyes said. Kane getting flagged is done. She paused. What's not done is whatever Kane set in motion before we got out of that basin. He had people in the field. Those people are still active. The sentence had barely landed when Burke's comms lit up. Not a call, a signal, a proximity alert from a device he'd placed on the road access 40 minutes ago as a standard precaution. Vehicle, Burke said. Northeast approach. Slow moving. Tom was at the window before anyone else moved, looking through the gap in the covered glass at the road that ran past the facility. Single vehicle, no headlights, running dark, which was the tell. Nobody runs dark on a rural service road at this hour for legitimate reasons. How far? He said. 300 meters. 300 meters at a slow vehicle pace, 90 seconds, maybe 2 minutes. Tom did the math on the room. 1 door, 2 windows on the ground floor. Rourke with a sprained ankle and 0 combat training. Burke, whose hands were steadier than his instincts. Rourke, Tom said, keeping his voice flat. Get to the back wall of the side room. Stay low. Stay down. Don't move unless I tell you. Rourke didn't argue. He moved. Burke, can you push the documentation to Carter's secure line independently of the device? Separate transfer? Burke was already at his equipment. If the line is still open, yeah, 60 seconds. Do it now. Reyes was beside Tom at the window, and she had the same read. She was already positioning, having a short exchange with Farrell in hand, signals that resolved into Farrell moving toward the door and Wren going to the other window. Tom assessed the approach angle of the vehicle, the sight lines from the road to the building, the available cover in the room, and the lack of any useful egress except the door that the vehicle was moving toward. The arithmetic of a defensive position with 4 trained personnel and 2 non-combatants against an unknown number in a vehicle was not good, and it was worse because at least one person on the other side had known where they were going before they started driving. They had the staging location, he said to Reyes. Kane, she said. Had to be. The vehicle stopped. Not at the building, short of it, by about 50 meters, pulling off the road into a dark section of unpaved shoulder, which meant they weren't rushing in, they were setting up, which meant more than one or two people and a plan. Tom's phone, the new one Reyes had given him, vibrated in his pocket. He checked the screen. Unknown number, domestic routing. He showed it to Reyes. She looked at it, and something crossed her face that he couldn't fully read. "Answer it," she said. He did. "Harker." The voice on the other end was one he hadn't heard in 15 years, and it was exactly the same, level, precise, utterly controlled. The voice of a man who pre-solved futures. "I'd like to avoid something ugly here." Tom said nothing for a moment. He looked at Reyes, who was watching him. He looked at the window, where the dark vehicle sat on the shoulder. "Kane," he said, "the transfer went through. I know that. I'm not calling about the documentation." A pause. "I'm calling about you. About me. You've been off the grid for 15 years, Tom. You have a daughter in college. You have a life you built carefully." The voice didn't change temperature. "What happens next doesn't have to involve any of that. You can walk away from this building tonight and be back on base mopping floors by Tuesday. Nobody needs to know you were here." Tom processed the offer with the flat analytical attention it deserved. "You're offering me a quiet exit. I'm offering you what you already chose, civilian life, distance. Your daughter doesn't need her father's name in an investigation." There it was, not a threat in the explicit sense. Kane was too careful for that. But the shape of one, the outline of what could happen if the name Marisol Harker appeared in documents connected to an active federal investigation into weapons diversion. The suggestion that proximity to Tom was a risk to her. Tom's hand tightened on the phone by a fraction. He controlled it before it showed in his voice. "And if I don't walk?" "Then this gets complicated," Kane said. "For everyone." Tom looked at Reyes. She'd heard enough from his side to follow the shape of it, and her expression was very still in the specific way of someone making a calculation. He made his own. "Victor," he said, using the first name deliberately, because Kane would hear exactly what he meant by it. "You don't get the rank, you get the name, because this is between us now. I've been mopping floors for 11 months. I've got calluses on my hands and bad knees, and I go to bed at 9 o'clock most nights." He paused. "I also walked out of the Korak Valley alone in 3 days with 2 men on my back and half my water. You signed the debrief on that. You know what I am when I decide to finish something." Silence. "The vehicle on the road," Tom said. "Pull it back." More silence. Tom counted 7 seconds. "This isn't over," Kane said. "No," Tom agreed. "It isn't. But the documentation is with Carter, your name is in it 14 times, and the only play you have left that doesn't make everything worse is to make everything worse. I'd think carefully about whether that's the play you want to make." He paused. "Pull the vehicle back, Victor." He heard Kane breathe once, twice, the sound of a pre-solved future running out of options. The call ended. Tom watched the window. 20 seconds. 30. The vehicle's engine turned over. He heard it faintly, and then the headlights came on and it pulled back onto the road and moved away in the direction it had come from. Farrell from the door said, "Vehicle is leaving." "I see it," Tom said. The room exhaled. Not dramatically. These weren't people who exhaled dramatically. But the quality of the air changed. Burke spoke from his equipment table. "Transfer confirmed. Carter's team has the full documentation package." Reyes sat down in the chair nearest the folding table. She put both hands flat on the surface, looked at them for a moment, then looked at Tom. "He'll run," she said. "Yes. Carter's team has him flagged. They'll have the exits covered." She didn't sound certain of this, which was accurate. Kane was the kind of man who would have prepared a disappearance the same way he prepared everything else, layered and redundant. Maybe. "Maybe," Tom agreed. From the back room, Rourke appeared in the doorway, still moving carefully on the wrapped ankle, looking at the room with the expression of someone who'd heard enough to understand but not enough to know what came next. "Are we clear?" he said. Tom looked at the window. The road was empty and dark. "For now," he said, which was the best he could honestly offer. He was reaching for his water bottle. His mouth was dry in the way of sustained adrenaline, a physical fact rather than a sensation, when his phone went off again. This time it was the original device, the one he'd brought from the base. The number was Marisol's. He answered before the second ring. "Hey, Dad." Her voice was different than it had been that morning, the kind of different that tightened his whole chest. "There are 2 men outside my apartment. They've been there for about an hour. I didn't want to call you earlier because I thought maybe I was... But they're still there, and one of them looked directly at me when I checked the window." The room, which had just exhaled, went cold again. Tom's voice stayed even by an act of will. "Are you inside right now?" "Yes." "Door's locked." "Don't open it. Don't go near the windows." He was already looking at Reyes, who'd heard enough. She was on her feet, reading his face. "Is your phone charged?" 80%. "Good. Stay on with me." He covered the microphone for half a second, just long enough to say to Reyes, "Kane moved on my daughter." Reyes's expression did something complicated and immediate. She already had the secondary phone in her hand. "I'll get base security to her building." "How long?" 20 minutes, maybe 15. Tom looked at the window. 20 minutes to Kellard State's campus from a security dispatch. And Kane had people outside Marisol's apartment right now, and the vehicle that had just pulled away from their location had a head start on any route to anywhere. "Dad?" Marisol's voice in his ear, very steady, very careful, her mother's quality of composure under pressure, the thing that always broke him a little when he saw it in her. "I'm here," he said. "I'm not going anywhere. Keep talking to me." He heard her breathe. And then he heard, very clearly through the phone, the sound of someone knocking on her door. The knock came again. 3 times, measured. Not the frantic knock of someone afraid, and not the heavy knock of someone forcing entry. The knock of someone who had time and knew it. "Don't answer it," Tom said into the phone. "I know," Marisol said. Her voice was low and even, and Tom recognized in it the specific quality of composure that came not from the absence of fear, but from the decision to function despite it. She'd grown up watching him make that decision. He hadn't known she was learning it. "Move away from the door," he said. "Toward the back of the apartment. Bathroom if you can. Interior wall, no windows." He heard her move. The soft sounds of careful feet on a hardwood floor, a door hinge, and then relative quiet. "I'm in the bathroom," she said. "Good. Stay there." He looked at Reyes, who had the security dispatch on the secondary phone and was speaking in the clipped, precise shorthand of someone conveying urgency without panic. Farrell was already moving, pulling his jacket and checking his sidearm with the automatic efficiency of a man who'd transitioned from one type of problem to another before the first one had fully resolved. 15 minutes for base security," Reyes said, covering her phone. "I've got a campus police unit 4 minutes out if they can get a door bypass." 4 minutes is too long, Tom said. "I know that." He did the math that he didn't want to do. The staging area was 25 minutes from Kellard State at speed. Reyes's security dispatch was 15 minutes from the campus. Campus police were 4 minutes out, but couldn't get through a locked door without delay. And the men outside Marisol's apartment were there right now, knocking with the patience of people who'd been told they had time. Kane had done this deliberately, not as a primary move. The vehicle on the road had been the primary move, meant to intimidate, to offer Tom an exit that cost nothing except his integrity. When that failed, this was the secondary. Marisol wasn't a target, she was a message. The difference mattered to Kane's legal exposure, and Kane was careful enough to know it, but the effect was the same from inside a locked bathroom 4 minutes away from a campus police unit that couldn't bypass a door. "Marisol," Tom said, "still here. I need you to call campus police directly. Tell them you have people at your door who you don't know and you feel unsafe. Don't wait for me to coordinate it." He paused. "Can you do that while staying on with me?" "I can't make 2 calls at once on this phone." "Then call them now. Call me back immediately after." A brief silence. "Okay." Another pause, smaller. "Dad, who are these people?" He thought about what to tell her. He thought about the 11 months of careful distance, the maintenance uniform, the quiet existence he'd built between her college schedule and his 0530 mornings in an empty mess hall. He thought about all the ways he'd tried to make sure this kind of thing couldn't reach her. People who are making a mistake, he said. Call campus police. Call me back. The line went quiet. Tom turned to Farrell. How fast can you get to Kellard State? 20 minutes, Farrell said. Maybe 18. Go. Tom looked at Wren. Go with him. Neither of them asked questions. Farrell grabbed the vehicle keys from the table and they were out the door in under 30 seconds. And Tom stood in the staging area with Reyes and Burke and Rourke and the acute physical weight of being in two places at once and physically capable of being in neither. His phone rang. He picked it up before it completed the first ring. Campus police are coming, Marisol said. They said 4 minutes. Good. He exhaled once. They'll get there before anyone gets through that door. You're okay. I know I'm okay, she said, with a faint edge that reminded him she was 22 and not 7. And he felt something that lived in the complicated territory between pride and guilt. I just want to know when you're going to tell me what's actually going on. Soon, he said. I promise. A long pause. He heard, distantly through the phone, the sound of a knock stopping. Then voices, not through her door, but from below, from the building entrance. Campus police, he hoped. He listened and couldn't tell. There are people downstairs, Marisol said. Uniforms? A pause while she moved. I can't see from the bathroom. Stay in the bathroom. Dad! Mari, please. Another pause, then, okay. He waited. 60 seconds that had the specific terrible quality of time that couldn't be moved through faster than it moved. He heard eventually her door open, not from someone forcing it, from her opening it, and voices he couldn't distinguish, and then her voice, clearer now, talking to someone, and then back to the phone. Campus police, she said, 2 officers. The men outside are gone. They left when they heard the officers in the stairwell. A pause. The officers want to talk to me. Let them. Tell them what you saw. Tom closed his eyes briefly. I'll be there as soon as I can. He ended the call and stood still for a moment, the phone in his hand, feeling the adrenaline making its exit through his nervous system in the slow, draining way it always did when an acute threat resolved without disaster. His hands were entirely steady. He had enough self-awareness to understand that wasn't normal, and that eventually, not now, but eventually, there would be a cost. Reyes was watching him. She'd heard enough. She's okay? For now. He looked at the door Farrell and Wren had gone through. Kane is fracturing. The vehicle pulled back. His people at Marisol's apartment withdrew. He's trying to pull threads in without creating more exposure, but he's doing it reactively now. He paused. He's running scenarios instead of executing plans. That's different. It means he's scared, Reyes said. It means he's calculating. Tom set the phone on the table. What's Carter's status? Reyes checked her secondary phone. A message had come through while Tom was on with Marisol. She read it, and something in her expression tightened in a way that wasn't alarm exactly, but was close to it. Kane left the building, she said. He got through a service exit before security locked it down. They have a vehicle description, and they've notified federal coordination, but she stopped. He's in the wind, Tom said. Temporarily, she said, which was the honest version of yes. Rourke, from the corner where he'd been sitting against the wall and staying out of the way with the intelligent self-awareness of a man who understood his role in this room, had shifted from asset to observer, said quietly, he has a contingency location. When Reyes looked at him, he continued, I heard enough in the compound to know he runs his operations in parallel tracks. The documentation covers the financial network, but there's a physical component, a secondary coordination point that he can go to ground in. I don't know where it is, but I know it exists. Tom looked at Rourke. Did you hear a name? A reference to a location? Anything geographic? Rourke pressed his lips together, thinking. Harson, he said. I heard that word twice. I don't know if it's a name or a place. The second time it was used with the property at, which made me think location. Tom looked at Reyes. She was already on the phone to Carter's team, relaying the word. and Tom watched her face while she listened to the response, and he saw her go still in the way of someone receiving information that lands cleanly, that fits. Harson Lake, she said. Private property registered to a shell company. Kane's team tracked it 18 months ago in a different context, and it came up clean. They closed the file. She paused. It's 40 minutes from here. Tom stood up. Carter's team is moving on it, Reyes said. They have jurisdiction. Kane is 40 minutes ahead of them, Tom said. And he knows they're coming because he's the kind of man who has a tripwire on every approach to a contingency location. He picked up his jacket. He'll be gone by the time they arrive, or he'll make them pay for arriving. Parker, I know the way he thinks, Tom said. Not loudly, not as an argument, just as a fact, the way you stated a fact. You said so yourself. Reyes stood there for a moment, looking at him with the evaluating gaze she'd used in the briefing, the one that was measuring not sentiment, but operational reality. Then she picked up her own jacket. Burke, she said, stay with Rourke. Don't open the door for anyone who doesn't give you the confirmation word. What's the confirmation word? Burke said. Kellard, she said. Go. Harson Lake was 40 minutes northeast, and they made it in 32, which said something about how Reyes handled a vehicle on a dark rural road that Tom filed without comment. He spent the drive thinking about Kane, not the man he'd become, but the operational methodology, the layered contingency planning, the specific way he thought about exits and approaches, and what he called managed sequencing, which was his term for the process of closing off unfavorable futures one at a time until only the future you wanted remained. The problem with managed sequencing was that it required accurate information at each decision point. Kane had been operating on good information until tonight. Now he was operating on damaged information. He knew the documentation had transferred. He knew the team had gotten out. He knew Marisol's building operation had failed. He knew he'd been flagged. What he didn't know was exactly what Rourke's documentation contained, what had been transferred versus what remained on the device, and whether Reyes had additional intelligence beyond what was in Rourke's files. That uncertainty was Kane's vulnerability right now. A man managing exits with incomplete information made tighter moves, more predictable moves. He went to the places he knew were clean because he'd checked them himself, not because someone else told him they were clean. Harson Lake fit that profile exactly. He'll have one way in and one way out that he considers viable, Tom said. Everything else will be set up to discourage approach. Rigged, Reyes said, keeping her eyes on the road. Probably not explosively. Too much exposure if someone stumbles across it. More likely detection. Motion sensors. Pressure plates feeding to a monitor inside. He wants to know someone's coming, not create a federal crime scene. Tom watched the dark road. He'll also have a vehicle staged at the secondary exit. He never goes to a location without a vehicle he controls. So we approach from the secondary exit, Reyes said. No, we approach from wherever he's not watching. Tom pulled up the satellite imagery on Reyes's secondary phone. She'd already pulled the location, anticipating this, and studied it. The property was roughly 6 acres, lake on the south side, access road from the northwest, tree line on the east and north. The main structure sat in the center, set back from the lake by maybe 150 meters, with a detached garage that Tom assessed as the staged vehicle location. There's a boat access point on the southeast corner of the lake shore. If the property has a dock, it's there. We don't have a boat. We don't need one. The approach from the lake shore is the one he's least likely to watch because he'd think you'd need a boat to use it. Tom looked at the imagery. The shore approach has 70 meters of clear ground between the tree line and the structure. Bad ground in daylight, manageable ground at this hour. Reyes was quiet for a moment. Carter's team is 25 minutes behind us. Then we have 25 minutes to make sure Kane is still there when they arrive. She drove for another few seconds. Define, make sure he's still there. I'll know when I see the ground, Tom said, which was the honest answer, and she accepted it. They parked the vehicle on a logging road 3/4 of a mile from the property boundary, under tree cover, and covered the distance on foot through dense second-growth forest that was wet from recent rain and loud underfoot in a way that required care. Tom took point because he'd asked for it, and Reyes had granted it without discussion. He moved the way he'd always moved in this kind of terrain, not fast, not slow, with a specific calibration of pace that minimized sound without sacrificing situation awareness. He was aware of Reyes behind him making about 70% as much noise, which for a second-growth forest in wet conditions was genuinely good. He revised his assessment of her upward for the third time since meeting her. The lake appeared through the trees as a flat darkness that reflected the cloud-filtered sky. Tom stopped at the tree line, and they both went down to one knee, and he took 2 minutes to observe. The dock, which was there, a floating aluminum structure with a small outboard tied to it. The shore between the dock and the main structure. The structure itself, which had 2 windows lit on the ground floor, and the detached garage's personnel door standing slightly open, which meant the staged vehicle was either gone or Kane was in the garage. "Garage," Tom said quietly, inclining his head. Reyes saw it too. She looked at him. "If he's loading the vehicle, he's still here," Tom said. She nodded, then gestured. "You left, me right, converge at the near corner of the structure." The classic approach to cut off angles without crossing each other's fields. Tom went left along the shore, staying in the shadow of the tree line as long as it held, and then crossing the open ground in a low, fast movement when the tree line ran out, covering the distance to the structure's near wall in the practiced way of a man for whom this was deeply encoded muscle memory. He reached the wall and pressed against it. Reyes materialized at the corner 30 seconds later, which was good timing on difficult ground. From inside the garage, sounds, movement, something being shifted, a heavy bag or a case. Kane was still here. They moved along the wall to the garage's main door, which was a roll-up that was partially raised, about 3 feet of clearance at the bottom. Through it, Tom could see the lower half of a vehicle, an SUV, dark, engine not running, and the lower half of a man loading something into the rear cargo space. Methodical, not rushing. That was Kane exactly. Rushing in a crisis was for people who hadn't prepared multiple futures. Tom looked at Reyes. She held up her credentials case in one hand and her sidearm in the other. He understood. She was the legal authority here. She leads the verbal. He positioned to her left and outside the direct line from the gap. Reyes crouched and called through the gap. "Victor Kane, federal officers, keep your hands where we can see them and step away from the vehicle." A pause. 2 full seconds. "Commander Reyes." Kane's voice was entirely composed. Tom heard in it what he'd heard on the phone, the quality of a man executing the next pre-solved future. "I'm going to turn around slowly. I'm not armed." "Hands first," Reyes said. Kane's hands appeared below the roll-up door, open, palms out, and then he crouched and came under the door and stood. He was in civilian clothes, dark jacket, dark pants, and he looked like what he was. A man in his late 50s who was in control of himself even when he wasn't in control of his situation. He scanned left, found Reyes. Scanned right, found Tom. And something moved through his face when he saw Tom. Not surprise exactly, because Kane didn't do surprise any more than he did rushing. Something more like the acknowledgement of a calculation that had come out differently than the model predicted. "Tom," he said. "Victor," Tom said. Kane looked at him for a long moment. "You look different." 11 months of floors, Tom said. "It changes you." A sound at the property's access road, headlights through the tree line, multiple vehicles, Carter's team, ahead of schedule. Kane heard it too. He didn't move, but something in his posture recalculated in a way that Tom recognized as the sound of the last pre-solved future closing off. "I want to speak to General Carter directly," Kane said to Reyes. "You'll get that opportunity," Reyes said. "On your knees, hands behind your head." Kane looked at her, then at Tom. He was still doing math that no longer had a solution, and after a moment he seemed to understand that, and he went to his knees on the garage's concrete floor with the careful, deliberate movement of a man preserving his dignity in the only way still available to him. Carter's team came through the tree line with flashlights and federal identification and the particular organized energy of people who'd been moving fast and arrived ready. The lead agent was a woman named Vasquez, and she took Kane into custody with efficient correctness, reading, securing, documenting, while 2 others swept the structure and the garage. Tom and Reyes stood back and let the process happen, and Tom watched Kane's face through all of it. And what he saw there was not rage and not fear, but something closer to the expression of a chess player who'd played a complex game and lost to a combination he'd underestimated. Kane looked at Tom once more, just before Vasquez walked him toward the lead vehicle. And that look was everything neither of them would say. The years of shared service, the operational history, the specific betrayal of a man who'd understood what the job required and used that understanding for something that negated everything it was supposed to protect. Tom held his gaze and didn't look away, and didn't offer anything that could be mistaken for sympathy. Kane got into the vehicle. The debrief took 5 hours. It was held at a federal facility 30 miles from Kellard Station, a building with no identifying signage and a parking lot that held 6 vehicles in varying states of unremarkable. Tom sat in a room with Reyes and 2 people from Carter's office, whose names he was given, and immediately filed as provisional until he understood their roles better. Carter himself appeared on a video link that was markedly more stable than the one Tom had used the night before, which told him something about whose office was funding the infrastructure. Tom went through everything sequentially, from the phone call at 0340 to Kane's arrest at the garage, and the 2 people from Carter's office asked precise questions that he answered precisely, and they wrote things down and occasionally exchanged looks that carried information he wasn't authorized to interpret. Reyes went through her own timeline in the adjacent room. He knew this from the brief, business-like communications she sent him during the gaps, the kind of coordination that had developed between them over about 18 hours of high-stakes shared experience and felt, strangely, like a relationship that had been in place much longer. Rourke's debrief was separate and longer, 4 hours of intelligence analysis that Tom wasn't part of and didn't ask about. When Rourke came out, he looked hollowed in the specific way of someone who'd just spent 4 hours transferring everything they'd been carrying alone for 14 months to people with the authority to act on it. He caught Tom's eye across the corridor and nodded once, which said enough. Tom called Marisol from a secure line during a break at hour 3. She was at a friend's place. She'd been moved there by campus security, and she was okay. And she was furious in the particular controlled way she had of being furious, which was worse than most people's uncontrolled versions. "I want to know everything," she said, "not the version where you decide what I need to know. Everything." "I know," he said. "When?" "Soon. In person." A pause. "Are you done? With whatever this was?" He thought about what done meant in this context. Kane was in custody. The documentation was with Carter's team. Rourke was out and intact. The operation was, by the relevant metrics, complete. What wasn't complete was the larger investigation, the weapons diversion network, the other nodes in the financial chain, the organizational structure that Kane was a part of, but hadn't built alone. That would take months, possibly years, and it wouldn't require Tom Harker. "The part that needed me," he said. "Yes." "Come see me," she said. Not a question. "I will," he said. "Tomorrow." He ended the call and sat in the break room with the bad institutional coffee and the particular quiet of a building full of people doing serious things in separate rooms, and he let himself feel the tiredness he'd been carrying since 0340 without doing anything about it except acknowledging it was there. Reyes found him there 20 minutes later. She looked like he felt, the particular worn quality of someone who'd been running on operational adrenaline for 36 hours and was now standing on the other side of it. She got coffee from the machine, sat across from him, and they were quiet for a moment in the way of people who'd been through something together and didn't need to perform recovery. "Carter wants to speak with you," she said finally. "I know. He's gonna offer you something." Tom looked at his coffee. "I know that too. Are you gonna take it?" He thought about what Carter might offer. A reinstatement, probably. Something that formalized his role, gave him the institutional cover that the night's work hadn't had. Maybe an advisory position, which was the kind of thing they offered people like him when they wanted the capability without the liability of a fully active operator who was 51 and hadn't carried a weapon professionally in 15 years. The offer would be careful, calibrated, respectful of what he'd demonstrated he still was. "No," he said. Reyes looked at him, not surprised. "You're going back to the floors." "I'm going to see my daughter," he said, "and then I'm going to figure out what comes after that." He paused.
which might be the floors. I haven't decided. She nodded slowly, turning her cup in her hands. For what it's worth, and I know this is not a thing you need from me, you were exactly what I needed on that team. Not what I expected. What I needed. She paused. The debris field call. The Kane phone call. The garage approach. She shook her head slightly. That was 15 years ago for you. Some things don't expire, he said. She nodded. No, they don't. Carter appeared on a tablet that one of his aides carried into the debrief room at the 4-hour mark, and he spoke to Tom directly for 12 minutes, and the offer was more or less what Tom had expected, a consulting role formally classified that would give him legal standing and institutional access for situations requiring his specific operational profile. The compensation was significant. The arrangement was respectful. Tom said, I appreciate it, General. I need time before I give you an answer. Carter said, take the time. He paused and something crossed his face that was not entirely the expression of a general managing an asset. For what it's worth, Tom, what you did tonight, bringing Kane to that garage, that's not in any file. That's not something that gets officially acknowledged. He stopped. But I know what it was. Tom said, that's enough, sir. It was, mostly. 3 days later, the story broke. Not all of it. The classified components stayed classified. The specific details of Rourke's placement and the documentation's contents never appeared publicly, but enough of it surfaced that the shape was visible to anyone paying attention. Victor Kane, Rear Admiral, retired pending formal proceedings, charged with conspiracy, misappropriation of classified resources, and complicity in the endangerment of a federal intelligence asset. 2 additional individuals in the weapons diversion network charged alongside him. The coverage was factual, heavy on institutional language, light on color. Tom read it on his phone in Marisol's apartment, sitting at her kitchen table with her textbooks still stacked at one end and her study guide still half finished, because she had a clinical rotation in 11 days and the world kept moving regardless. She'd made coffee that was much better than the institutional kind, and she'd sat across from him while he told her everything, which had taken about an hour and cost him in ways he hadn't fully predicted. She listened the way she always listened, still, attentive, not interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, then she said, You should have told me sooner about what you were before. I know. Not all of it, but enough. She looked at her coffee. I'm not a kid, Dad. I'm not going to break. I know that too, he said. I think I was protecting myself more than I was protecting you. She looked at him when he said that, a direct look that was also her mother's, the quality of seeing a thing clearly and not needing it to be different. Yeah, she said. I figured. They sat with that for a while, the way you sat with things that were true and didn't have a clean resolution. And eventually she asked him what came next, and he said he wasn't sure yet, and she said that was okay, and he believed her. He left her apartment at 1900 and drove back to base in the flat, amber light of a November evening, and thought about floors. About the 0530 mornings, and the mop bucket, and the quiet of the mess hall before anyone arrived. About whether those things still made sense, and whether they'd made sense in the first place, or whether they'd been a waiting room he'd built himself without admitting. That's what it was. He was pulling into the base parking area when his phone buzzed with a message from a number he didn't recognize. He looked at it, sitting in the dark car with the engine running. The message was 7 words. The network is larger than one node. No name, no context. Just 7 words and the specific weight of information delivered by someone who knew exactly how much it would change. Tom stared at the message in the darkness of the parking area, the engine running, the base lights casting their familiar flat geometry through the windshield, and he understood that whatever he'd thought was finished had just become something else. Something with no clean edge and no certain perimeter, something that would require exactly the kind of mind and memory and operational understanding that no consulting role could fully capture and no maintenance uniform could fully conceal. He turned the engine off. He sat in the dark, and after a long moment, he called the number back. The number rang twice before someone picked up. No greeting, just the ambient sound of a space with hard surfaces, concrete probably, or tile, and the quality of silence that surrounded someone who was being deliberately still. Tom waited. "You called back faster than I expected," the voice said. Male, middle register, with the careful diction of someone who'd trained themselves out of a regional accent without fully succeeding. Tom didn't recognize it, which was itself information. He knew most of the voices that would have access to a number capable of reaching him on a line that had been issued 48 hours ago under a classified operational umbrella. "You sent me 7 words," Tom said. "Either they mean something or they don't." "They mean something." "Then tell me what they mean." A pause. The kind of pause that was assessment, not hesitation. "Not on this line. Not tonight." Another pause. "But I'll tell you this much. Kane was the piece they were willing to lose. The operation identified him as expendable 18 months ago. Everything that happened, his exposure, his arrest, it was managed, not by your side." Tom sat with that. Outside the car, the base lights were doing what they always did, indifferent and geometric. "You're telling me someone let him burn?" "I'm telling you the fire was set deliberately, and the people who set it are still holding the matches." The voice stopped. "You took down a node. That's real. Rourke's documentation is real. The charges against Kane are real. The 2 people arrested alongside him are real. None of that is theater." A beat. "But the network didn't lose anything it couldn't afford to lose." "Who are you?" Tom said. "Someone who's been watching from inside for 2 years and has run out of good options." The voice was flat, controlled, the tone of a man who'd been carrying something alone for long enough that the weight had become structural. "I have documentation that goes 3 levels above Kane. I need someone who can receive it without it disappearing before it reaches people with authority to act." "Why me?" "Because you just demonstrated something that's hard to fake," the voice said. "You had a clean exit. A vehicle pulling away, Kane on the phone offering you your life back. Your daughter's safe. You could have taken it." The pause that followed had a different quality than the earlier ones, something almost personal in it. "You didn't." Tom looked at the base through the windshield. He thought about the mop bucket and the empty mess hall and the 0530 mornings and all the ways he told himself he was living rather than waiting. "Give me 48 hours, he said. "I need to verify some things before I agree to anything." "You have 36, the voice said. "After that, the window I currently have closes." A brief silence. "And Harker, I know about your daughter. I know where she lives. I'm telling you that, so you understand I'm telling you the truth when I say she's not a card in this game. Not for me." The line clicked off. Tom sat in the dark car for a long moment. The engine was off and the interior was getting cold, but he didn't move yet. He was thinking about what the voice had said: managed exposure, expendable nodes, matches still being held. He was running it against what he knew, which was considerable, and what he could verify, which was less. He called Reyes. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she hadn't been sleeping, which did not surprise him. "Harker, I need to meet tomorrow morning," he said. "Early." A pause. "How early?" "Before anyone else is in the building." Another pause, longer. He heard in it the sound of her recalibrating. She'd thought this was over, or near enough. She'd been wrong, and she was smart enough to understand that from the quality of his voice without needing him to explain. "Oh, 5:30, she said. "The conference room we used for the initial brief." "I'll be there," he said, and ended the call. He finally got out of the car. The night air was cold and smelled of the bay, which was something he'd noticed when he first arrived at Kellard and had stopped noticing around month 3. The way you stop noticing background things when they became consistent enough. He noticed it again now. He stood in the parking area for a moment and breathed it in and thought about the Korak Valley and Harson Lake and a mess hall at 0530 and a mop bucket that squeaked on institutional tile, and he tried to locate exactly what it was he wanted. He didn't find a clean answer. He found something more complicated and more honest. A recognition that what he wanted and what he was capable of weren't separate questions, and that pretending otherwise had cost him 11 months of half-existence that he dressed up as peace. He went inside. Reyes was already in the conference room when he arrived, with coffee that was marginally better than the institutional version because she'd brought it from somewhere else. He told her about the call, all of it, verbatim, as close as he could manage. and watched her face process it with the attentiveness she brought to everything that mattered. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. A source inside the network, she said. That's what he's presenting as. Could be a setup. Kane's people or whoever is above Kane trying to get visibility into what you know and who you're talking to. Yes, Tom said. It could be. But you don't think it is. He thought about the voice, the specific weight of something being carried alone for too long. You couldn't manufacture that quality entirely. It leaked through even careful performance. I think the probability of genuine source outweighs the probability of setup, but I'm not certain, and certainty isn't available. He paused. What I know is that if he's real, we have 36 hours before we lose the window. Reyes turned her coffee cup in her hands. She did this when she was working through something, and Tom had learned it in the way you learned a person's habits quickly when you'd been through compressed, high-stakes time with them. Carter needs to know, she said. Yes. If we bring Carter in, the circle expands. I know. Tom looked at the table. Kane was on Carter's team. That doesn't mean Carter has a problem. Kane was there because of a legitimate read on his regional expertise, and Carter moved on him the moment the flag went up. But it means we were wrong about access once. We need to think carefully about how we bring this in. Reyes nodded slowly. What do you want to do? It was the right question, and she'd asked it the right way. Not what should be done, not what procedure required, but what he wanted, which was a different thing because it acknowledged that he had standing in the decision. He'd earned it over the last 36 hours in the field, and she was honoring that without making a production of it. I want to call Carter directly, Tom said. Not through the aid chain, him, this morning, before anyone else gets into the building. He paused. And I want to be in the room when we make the call. Done, she said, and reached for her phone. Carter picked up in 4 rings, which for 05:45 was fast enough to confirm he wasn't sleeping soundly either. Reyes briefed him in 2 minutes flat, clean, sequential, no editorializing. Carter listened without interrupting, and when she finished, there was a silence that had the quality of a man running a very large calculation. The voice on the call, Carter said. Any identification? No, Tom said. But he had the number, the operational line from the Rourke extraction. That's a short list. Very short, Carter agreed, and something in his tone shifted. Not alarm, but the specific attentiveness of someone who'd just understood the scope of what he was holding. All right, here's what we do. Tom, I need you to set a meeting with this source. Controlled location, your choice, people of your choosing. A pause. I'm going to stay out of the direct contact chain until we know what he has. If he's real and he's inside, the fewer names he has to worry about, the better. And if he's not real, Tom said, then the people in the room are you and Reyes, and we learned something useful about who's trying to run plays on us. Carter's voice was dry without being dismissive. Either outcome is informative. Tom looked at Reyes. She gave a slight nod. We'll set it for tomorrow, Tom said. I'll send the location through Reyes' secondary line. Good, Carter paused. Tom. Sir. What you did at Harson Lake. Another pause, and Tom heard in it something that was not quite apology and not quite gratitude, but occupied the territory between them. I've been in this business a long time. I've known men who walked away from it and couldn't find their way back to who they were. You came back in 36 hours and didn't lose a step. A beat. I wanted to say that directly. Tom thought about what to do with that. He said, "Thank you, General," which was accurate and sufficient, and the call ended. The meeting with the source was set for the following evening at a location Tom chose, a public space with multiple exits, enough ambient noise to prevent easy surveillance, enough civilian presence to make violence unlikely. A food market in a mid-sized city 40 minutes from the base, the kind of place with exposed beams and vendors selling things from folding tables, and a crowd that was thick enough on a Tuesday evening to provide cover without being so dense that observation was impossible. Tom arrived 40 minutes early and walked the space twice. The source came in at exactly the time Tom had sent through the relay line, which suggested either punctuality as a professional habit or the kind of careful timing that came from doing advanced surveillance. And when Tom saw him, he understood it was probably both.
He was younger than the voice had suggested, late 30s with the unremarkable appearance of someone who'd cultivated it deliberately. Medium height, dark coat, nothing about him that would catch a camera's attention or lodge in a memory. He found Tom without looking like he was looking, which was a specific skill, and sat down across from him at the small table Tom had chosen near the back of the market's central atrium. "Harker," he said. "You have a name?" Tom said. "Presently, Doyle." He said it in a way that implied it was a name rather than the name, and Tom accepted that as the starting position for this particular conversation. Doyle reached into the inside pocket of his coat and produced a small drive, the kind of enclosed, ruggedized device used for secure transfer of large data packages, and set it on the table between them. He didn't push it across. He just set it there. 14 months inside, Doyle said. 2 years before that building, the access. I have transaction records, communication logs, organizational mapping for a network that runs from field procurement through 3 layers of shell financing to a coordinating structure that sits inside 2 separate federal agencies. He paused. Kane was the operational interface. He was useful because he had the clearances and the regional knowledge, but he was not the architect. Tom looked at the drive. "Who is?" "It's on the drive," Doyle said, "along with the documentation to support it. I'm not going to say names in this space." "Why come to me? You could have gone direct to federal investigators." Doyle looked at him. "I did. 14 months ago. I was given a case officer, established a contact protocol, began passing information." He stopped. 8 months in, the information I was passing started showing up in operational decisions on the network side before it should have been possible. Someone in the investigative chain was reading my reports. His voice stayed flat, but Tom heard in it the residue of something that had happened to him when he understood that. Not fear, but the particular disorientation of discovering that the structure meant to protect you was the structure you needed protection from. "I went dark. I've been holding this package for 6 months, waiting for a viable conduit. And I'm viable because you're not in any active investigative chain," Doyle said. "You were a janitor 4 days ago. Your name doesn't appear in any current operational file that the network would have access to." He paused. "You also just demonstrated that you'll run an operation clean when the stakes are personal. That's not nothing." Tom looked at the drive. He thought about what it represented. 6 months of a man sitting alone with information that could get him killed, waiting for a person who wasn't compromised. He thought about Rourke in a subsurface room counting hours. He thought about the quality of patience required to hold something that important for that long without acting prematurely or giving up. He picked up the drive. "I need 48 hours to verify what's on this before we move it to people with authority to act," Tom said. Doyle nodded. "I know." He started to rise, then stopped. "One more thing." He met Tom's eyes. "The people above Kane, one of them knows your name now. Not from the investigation, from Kane's arrest. Kane talked to someone after Harson Lake, before he was fully secured, and your name came up." He paused. "They won't move directly. It's too visible after what just happened, but they'll want to know what you're doing and who you're talking to." "So they'll watch," Tom said. "Yes." "Then we move faster than they watch," Tom said, and Doyle looked at him for a moment with an expression that was the closest thing to relief Tom had seen on his face, and then he stood up and walked out of the market the same way he'd come in, unremarkable, unhurried, impossible to distinguish from the other 100 people in the space. Tom sat for another 10 minutes without moving, running the drive through his fingers and thinking about managed sequencing and expendable nodes and matches still being held. Then he went to find Reyes. The next 3 weeks moved differently than the weeks before them. Not faster exactly. Some of it was very slow. The deliberate pace of verification and legal preparation that couldn't be rushed without creating vulnerabilities that would cost more than the time they saved. But it moved with direction, which was different from the circular, contained motion of a man cleaning the same floors every morning. Tom was aware of the difference in his body before he was aware of it consciously, the way you became aware of a change in air pressure. Doyle's documentation was what he said it was: comprehensive, sourced, legally actionable in ways that Rourke's material, as significant as it was, hadn't been.
Where Rourke had documented Kane's transactions and communications, Doyle had the organizational architecture, the names, the structures, the specific mechanisms through which military procurement funds had been diverted through 3 layers of fictional contracting entities and converted into operational financing for a weapons pipeline that had been running for 7 years. 7 years. Tom sat with that number for a while when it first came into clear focus. 7 years of institutional betrayal, of men with authority using the structures built to protect the country to fund operations that endangered it, and the whole edifice had stayed upright because it was built inside the thing meant to bring it down. The names on the drive were 4 people above Kane. 2 of them were currently serving in positions that gave them oversight of the very investigative functions that would normally handle something like this, which explained Doyle's contaminated case officer, and explained the 6 months of isolation, and explained why a man with 2 years of careful access building and 14 months of field exposure had ended up sitting across from a naval-based janitor in a food market as his best viable option. Carter handled the jurisdictional problem by going sideways rather than up, a move that Tom found elegant in the way of solutions that were obvious in retrospect, but required a particular quality of institutional understanding to see in the moment. He took the documentation to a Senate Oversight Subcommittee through a back channel that bypassed every agency that any of the 4 names had access to, and the subcommittee convened a closed session within 72 hours that Tom was not in, but was briefed on afterward by Reyes in the characteristically compressed, precise way she briefed everything. All 4 were placed on administrative suspension pending investigation within a week of that session. 2 were arrested 11 days later on a Thursday morning, in a coordinated action that was reported publicly as a federal corruption investigation without the specific details that remained classified. The other 2 resigned and retained attorneys and were the subjects of ongoing proceedings that Tom understood would take considerably longer and produce considerably more paperwork before they produced results, because that was how institutional accountability actually worked, not in clean, decisive moments, but in the long, grinding machinery of process that was unglamorous and necessary. Kane's formal charges were expanded 3 times as Doyle's documentation connected his transactions to the broader network. His attorney entered negotiations and then withdrew from negotiations and then re-entered them, which Tom understood as the pattern of a man who kept thinking he had more to trade than he did and kept discovering he was wrong. The final charge sheet, when it was filed publicly, ran to 11 pages. Tom read it once, not out of satisfaction, but because he believed in understanding the shape of completed things. He felt almost nothing reading it, which he found less troubling than he'd expected. He thought there would be some discharge of the thing he'd been carrying, some release, some moment of resolution that felt like resolution. Instead, there was just the flat, factual recognition that a man who had used his position and his knowledge to cause serious harm was now facing serious consequences, and that this was correct, and that correct things didn't always feel like anything in particular. The feeling came later, and from a direction he hadn't expected. It was Whitmore who called him. 17 days after Harson Lake, on a Saturday morning when Tom was at Marisol's apartment helping her move a bookshelf that had been in the wrong position since she moved in, his phone rang with the Admiral's direct line, and he stepped into the hallway to take it. "Tom?" Whitmore said. "Sir?" "I know what happened. Not the classified specifics, but enough." A pause. "I also know that when I crouched down in that mess hall and made a joke at your expense, I didn't know who I was talking to, and I've been thinking about that." Another pause, longer. "I owe you an apology." Tom leaned against the hallway wall. From inside the apartment, he could hear Marisol moving things around, talking to herself in the low running commentary she always kept up when she was doing physical tasks. He'd missed that sound without knowing he was missing it. "You didn't know," Tom said. "That's not entirely an excuse," Whitmore said. "The point of the exercise was to make someone feel small. It didn't matter to me who I was talking to. That's the part I've been sitting with." He stopped. "You answered with your call sign. You could have said anything, made up a name, deflected. You didn't." "No," Tom agreed. "Why not?" Tom thought about it. The mess hall floor, the scrub brush, Whitmore crouching down with that practiced ease of a man making a moment, the specific feeling of being treated as furniture. "Because I'm not ashamed of what I was," he said. And I'm not ashamed of what I am now. The uniform changed. The person didn't. Whitmore was quiet for a moment. He stopped, started again. I'd like to do something to formally recognize what you did. Your contribution to the Rourke extraction and the Kane investigation.
There's a mechanism for acknowledging civilian participation in operations of this. No, Tom said, not unkindly. A pause. No? With respect, Admiral, I don't need a ceremony. Tom watched a pattern of light from the window at the end of the hall shift across the floor. What I needed was to do the job. That part's done. He paused. What would help me more than a commendation is an honest conversation with the base commander about whether there's a different role for me here. Something that uses what I actually am. Not a formal reinstatement. I'm not going back in uniform. But something that's not also not the floors. A silence that had a different quality than the earlier ones. Thoughtful, recalibrating. I think, Whitmore said slowly, that we can have that conversation. That's enough, Tom said. After he ended the call, he stood in the hallway for another moment. He heard Marisol say from inside, "Are you going to help me with this, or are you just going to lurk out there?" He pushed off from the wall and went back in. The bookshelf went to the right wall, which was where it should have been, and they stood back and looked at it, and Marisol said, "That's so much better," with the specific satisfaction of a spatial problem correctly solved. And Tom agreed, and then they made lunch with whatever was in her kitchen, which was not much but enough. They ate at the table that still had textbooks at one end. Her last clinical rotation had started and the books had multiplied. And it was the kind of ordinary, unguarded afternoon that Tom had spent 11 months adjacent to without fully inhabiting. He noticed himself inhabiting it now. He noticed specifically that he wasn't waiting for anything. Marisol looked up from her food at some point and said, without particular preamble, "You're different." "Am I?" "Less," she searched for the word, "less like you're holding something in reserve, like you were always about to leave even when you weren't leaving." She considered this. "You seem more here." He thought about that, about the Karak Valley, and the mess hall, and the staging area in the dark, and the food market, and the drive he'd carried to Reyes, and the 3 weeks of process that had followed, about what it meant to do the thing you were built for, not because you'd been waiting to do it again, but because it needed doing, and you were the one who could. The difference between those two motivations was the difference between serving your own need and serving something actual, and the difference mattered even if the action looked identical from outside. "I think I was using the floors as a waiting room," he said. "I didn't know it." Marisol looked at him. "A waiting room for what?" "I'm not sure," he said. "Maybe just permission to still be what I am after everything." He paused. "I had it the whole time. I just didn't know how to pick it up." She was quiet for a moment. "Mom would have told you that in about 12 words, she said. "Yes," he agreed. "She would have." They sat with that the way they sat with things involving Lena, not painfully, not anymore, but with the honest weight of an absence that hadn't diminished so much as it had become incorporated, part of the structure of things. "I'm proud of you," Marisol said. "I know you don't need that from me, but I'm saying it anyway." "I need it more than you think," Tom said. "That." Doyle resurfaced 6 weeks later through a different relay line, a new number, a brief message that said only that he was clear and wanted to debrief fully with people he trusted, and he'd named Tom among them. Tom passed the message to Carter and let the proper channels handle the contact this time, because the proper channels were cleaner now in ways they hadn't been before, and because Tom understood something he hadn't fully understood at the start. Knowing when to hand something off was as much a skill as knowing when to hold it. He heard, through Reyes, that Doyle's formal debrief produced 3 additional leads in the network structure that investigators had not identified from Rourke's documentation or Doyle's initial package. He heard weeks later that 2 of those leads had resulted in arrests. He heard nothing further after that, which was appropriate. He wasn't in the chain anymore and didn't need to be. Rourke sent him a message, short, through Reyes as intermediary, a few lines that said, "I heard your name from enough people on the way out that I needed to say thank you directly. I also heard you went back to mopping floors before any of this. That's either very zen or very stubborn. Either way, I respect it. His sister had gotten into a trial program for her medical condition, he added. Early results were good. Tom read that twice. He didn't reply immediately. He sat with it for a while, the way you sat with things that cost you something and were worth the cost. And eventually he wrote back a short answer. Take care of yourself. You did the hard part. He sent it and went back to what he was doing. The formal role that Whitmore arranged, through Captain Forsyth and with Carter's institutional backing, was titled Senior Operational Consultant, Classified Programs, which was language vague enough to mean almost anything and specific enough that people who needed to understand it would. It was 3 days a week, irregular schedule, no uniform, no rank, no pretense of anything except that Tom Harker had operational knowledge and analytical capability that the base found useful and intended to use. The other 4 days remained his. He kept the maintenance job for 2 more weeks, finishing out what he'd committed to because he'd committed to it, and that still meant something to him. On his last day, he cleaned the mess hall at 05:30 the way he always had. Floors, serving line, coffee urns, and he pushed the mop bucket out through the double doors at 06:20 when the first group of sailors came in and nobody looked at him on the way out. That was fine. He didn't need anyone to look. He was in the parking area loading his cleaning cart into the maintenance vehicle for the last time when he heard his name. He turned and found Kowalski, the QU instructor who'd started the whole thing in the mess hall, who'd made the joke that Whitmore had turned into a question, standing on the sidewalk outside the building entrance. Kowalski wasn't a stupid man. He'd connected the dots, or enough of them, in the weeks since the mess hall moment became something people talked about in the specific, quiet way of information that circulated without official confirmation. He had the look of someone who'd been working out what to say and hadn't found anything adequate. I didn't know, Kowalski said. I know you didn't, Tom said. That's not... Kowalski stopped. Tried again. I wouldn't have... I know that too, Tom said. He closed the cargo door of the maintenance vehicle and looked at Kowalski directly, without performance in either direction. Not magnanimous, not cold, just straight. The thing is, it shouldn't take knowing who I am. That's the part worth sitting with. Kowalski stood there for a moment. He nodded once, slowly, in the way of someone receiving something they couldn't argue with and weren't trying to. Tom got in the vehicle and drove it back to the maintenance bay and turned in his equipment, and that was the end of that chapter. There are things you learn about yourself only when you've been stripped down to the version of you that no one watches. When the rank is gone and the commendations are in a box in a closet, and the call sign is something nobody's spoken in over a decade, and you're on your knees scrubbing dried gravy off a floor at 05:30, and nobody in the room thinks you're anything except the person who maintains the space where more important things happen. Tom Harker learned, in 11 months of that the quality of his character did not require an audience, that the discipline, the precision, the attentiveness to what was actually happening versus what looked like it was happening, those things didn't turn off when the context turned ordinary. They were just there, running quietly, like equipment that didn't need to be supervised to function. He also learned that this was not enough, that running quietly and existing fully were not the same thing, and that a man could spend years confusing the maintenance of himself with the use of himself and call it humility when it was something closer to avoidance. What the Rourke operation gave him was not a return to what he'd been. He was 51 with bad knees and 11 months of institutional catering work in his recent history, and the man who'd run the Corach Valley at 32 was related to him the way a building's foundation was related to the floor you walked on, present in everything, directly visible in nothing. What the operation gave him was the ending of a question he'd been asking sideways for years, the one he'd dressed up as contentment and peace and letting go. The question of whether the person he'd been and the person he'd become were compatible, whether service and fatherhood and loss and survival and ordinary life could all belong to the same life without one of them canceling another out. They could. He knew that now in a way that lived in the body rather than the mind, which was the only kind of knowing that mattered when the knowing got tested. Marisol graduated on a Saturday in May, in a ceremony that ran 40 minutes too long because they always did, in an auditorium that smelled of folding chairs and the particular floral arrangement choices of institutions trying to feel festive.
Tom sat in the third row with a program he'd already read twice and watched his daughter cross the stage in her nursing whites and shake the hand of the school's clinical director and accept a degree that represented 4 years of work she'd done largely on her own, and he felt something that he didn't try to name because naming it would have made it smaller. She found him afterward in the crowd outside, still in her whites, navigating through families with the competence of someone who always knew where she was going, and she walked straight to him and hugged him in the straightforward way she'd always had. No performance, just real. And he hugged her back and didn't say anything for a moment because there wasn't anything that needed to be said. "I have a job offer," she said, pulling back. "Kellar General, ICU." "I heard," he said. He hadn't. He'd suspected. She laughed, which meant she knew he was guessing. "I wanted to stay close," she said, not apologetically, just as a fact. "Is that okay?" "It's more than okay," he said. She looked at him with her mother's eyes in her own face, the combination that still landed differently than he was ever quite ready for. "You look good, Dad," she said. "You look like you again." He thought about what to say to that. He thought about the 5:30 mornings and the mop bucket and a phone call at 3:40 and a debris field in the dark and a food market and a drive that had changed the shape of things. He thought about Lena and the house in Portland and a 7-year-old girl who'd learned composure under pressure from watching him make the decision to function anyway. He thought about the fact that some things didn't expire. "I'm working on it," he said, which was honest, and she took his arm as they walked toward the parking lot in the warm May afternoon. And it was enough. It was, in the end, exactly enough. Not because everything was resolved without remainder, because it wasn't, and he'd stopped expecting that. Kane's trial was ongoing. The network's remaining threads were still being followed. Doyle was somewhere doing whatever came next for a man who'd spent 2 years building access to something corrupt, and 3 more weeks transferring everything he'd built to people who could use it to correct the record. Tom's knees still hurt on cold mornings, and he still woke at 0300 and probably always would. But he knew who he was now in the full sense, not just the version that showed up in classified briefings and call sign histories, and not just the version that pushed a mop bucket across institutional tile. Both of them. All of it. The decorated operator and the grieving widower and the father who'd done his imperfect best, and the man who'd walked back into a basin he'd nearly died in 15 years ago because someone needed it done, and he was the one who could. He'd spent 11 months waiting for permission to be all of that at once. The only person who'd ever needed to give it was him.